All right. Hello, Labbers. I'm Brian. I'm here with Matthew Friedman, who just posted an article on the QBs for week one, breaking down all of them based on our models. He talked about the ones that were atop our pro models built by guys like Jonathan Bales, Peter Jennings, Sports Geek, Adam Levitan, etc. And then also some that just had really nice data points that could be intriguing DFS plays. And we're going to spend just a couple minutes here talking about some of those guys Matthew wrote about and some data points that he found interesting. Matt, let's start with the top. Some of the most expensive guys. The most expensive quarterback in week one is Ben Roethlisberger. He's on the road in Cleveland. I think we all know about his now mythical home road splits. But there are also some other splits that are important. First, that he's facing the Cleveland Browns. And second, he has Martavis Bryant and really all of his weapons in Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell on the field. That is not something he's had for a lot of the last couple of years, and he does. So interesting player this week, definitely pricey. What are your thoughts on Ben Roethlisberger?
Yeah, and we talked about him on the Flex Pod that we did, last night with Pete and Levitan. And I agree with Pete that the home road splits really aren't a concern, especially with Martavis back. Ben's splits with Martavis are huge. Even if you look at his splits on the road with Martavis, he has still done amazingly well in those games. So I'm not really worried about the home road splits. Two things that are of a concern. One, as you mentioned, he is the most expensive quarterback on DraftKings, and just in general, it's questionable whether you want to pay up for a quarterback. And if you do want to pay up, I think you generally want that guy to be in the most optimal situation he can be in. And then secondly, he probably will have double-digit ownership. I think if you're paying up, you probably want a guy who's not going to be highly owned. And it's not as if Roethlisberger's ownership is going to be prohibitive, but it's going to be higher than someone like Aaron Rodgers, who I think out of the top four salaried guys is probably the pivot play. He has a tough matchup, certainly against Seattle, whose secondary is legendary at this point. But what we have to remember about Rodgers is that he's at home, he's favored. He's a top two perennial fantasy quarterback. He led the league with 40 touchdowns last year, and we're projecting him to have double-digit ownership. I think basically anytime you can get Rodgers at home – with single-digit ownership. Yeah.
Right.
Anytime you can get Rodgers at home with single-digit ownership, maybe don't go overweight on him, but definitely have some portfolio exposure in GPPs.
Yeah. So, Rodgers has faced Seattle at home twice in the last couple of years, and he has met his salary-based expectations in each of those games, and he's cheaper than he normally is. He's only $7K on DraftKings. So I think definitely playing, you're right, single-digit ownership is definitely intriguing. Going down a little bit, who are some guys that you think might be a little bit cheaper and could be popular in cash games?
Yeah, so, in cash games, and he's someone who is near the top of our models, is Carson Wentz. For cash games, he's probably the guy that if you're looking to pay down on DraftKings, you will certainly consider him. He had an inconsistent rookie season, but at the end of the season, he did have the fourth most passing yards of all time for any rookie quarterback. And then he has the opportunity of going against a Washington defense that is not good and might even somehow be worse than they were last year. Probably about the same. So it's a good spot for him to kick things off in week one. And then another guy who's intriguing is DeShone Kizer. He's not an upside guy by any means, but he has good running ability. He has a bottom five salary on both sites. But what's intriguing, and this is tied to his rushing ability, he does actually have a top five floor projection for this week. And, what we've found in doing projections is that those guys who do have running ability like Tyrod Taylor or Colin Kaepernick in the past, those guys tend to have higher floors. And so DeShone Kizer, you never feel safe about a rookie quarterback in week one playing, as an underdog against a divisional opponent. But at that, that said, he's cheap and he does have a pretty reasonable floor. It wouldn't take much for him to meet his expectations.
Yeah, definitely. Always tough to predict Kizer. We see here in the matchups page that we have. No data yet. Obviously, this will fill in throughout the season. But, always tough to project a rookie quarterback, especially in his first game. Who are some other quarterbacks that stood out to you, Matt, just in terms of interesting data points, guys? You think that might be some interesting contrarian plays with high ceilings in GPPs? Anyone else you want to talk about?
Yeah, one guy is Carson Palmer, and obviously he had a prolific 2015 season. 2016, he was bound to regress, and I'd say, regressed further than most people thought he would. But by the end of the season, he was rounding back into form. He's not very expensive on either site. What he does have is a fantastic matchup against the Lions, who last year were top 4 in fantasy points per game allowed to opposing quarterbacks. So he has a very nice matchup, specifically if you wanted to stack him, and I'll probably touch on this in the wide receiver breakdown, but if you wanted to stack him with really any of those wide receivers, Fitz, John Brown, even J.J. Nelson as a guy to throw in there if you're doing a lot of lineups. The Lions allowed the second most points last year to wide receivers. So I think there is some stacking potential there. And Carson Palmer, I don't expect him to be too highly owned.
Do you think part of that, and this is a little off topic, do you think part of that is because of the projected chalkiness of his running back, David Johnson, and people don't necessarily like to use a quarterback and running back in the same lineup?
Yeah, that's sharp. I think that's a big part of it. And obviously, if you wanted to stack both of those guys, you could, because Johnson is a prolific receiver. But yeah, I think people are going to be looking to go more towards Johnson, which will put them off of the other Cardinals in that matchup.
Sounds great. Any last quarterbacks you want to touch on, Matt?
Yeah, a couple of guys, Mariota and Stafford. They're both popping well in our models, especially Mariota on FanDuel. He's kind of the consensus top-ranked quarterback right now on FanDuel. Of course, if news breaks, projections can change and everything like that, so people should always be looking at the models and following our news feed. But, Mariota, he struggled a little bit in the first month of the season, but after that, he was a top 5 fantasy quarterback until he had the fractured ankle. He's returned in the preseason. He's looked pretty good, and he gets the privilege of facing the Raiders, who last year were 25th in pass DVOA. So I think it's a pretty good spot for him. And that game against the Raiders has the second highest over-under on the slate. So it could be a shootout where, even though the team tends to run the ball a lot, they could pass more than they normally want to, just because of the type of game they're in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so pivoting over to our Vegas dashboard, the 2 highest total games that are above 50, that and the Packers and Seahawks, both are projected to be close games. So could have a shootout on both sides. I just wrote an article about game stacks, and I think that the 2 quarterbacks here, Mariota versus Carr, could be very good GPP plays. Any other guys you want to hit on before we get out of here, Matt?
One more, Stafford,
Sure.
in that matchup against the Lions. He's showing pretty well in our DraftKings model. He's let's see, last year. So it's tough. He has a tough matchup against the Cardinals, right? They were 3rd in pass DVOA, but he's cheap relatively, and he is tied for the slate lead with 6 Pro Trends. So that is one thing that is in his favor, and he's probably not going to be highly owned.
Very fair. Yeah, a lot of good options this week. Week 1's always definitely interesting to try to project ownership. Quarterback ownership is definitely much flatter than other positions, just because there's so many good options. The floors of these quarterbacks are so high. So definitely an interesting position. Freedman is going to have breakdowns for wide receivers, running backs, and tight ends coming soon over the next couple of days. We'll record videos for them. So keep your eye out for those, and we'll talk to you guys soon.